Nirvana is a three-piece from the outskirts of Seattle, Washington. Kurt, guitar, voice, and Krist, bass, have struggled with too many undedicated drummers for the past 3 years. Performing under such names as Bliss, Throat Oyster, Pencap Chew, Ted Ed Fred, etc., for the last 9 months we have had the pleasure to take Chad drums under our wings and develop what we are now and always will be, Nirvana. To understand Kurt Cobain, you need to understand the environment he was born into, Aberdeen, Washington. I think Chris Novoselic put it best. It's cloudy and rainy, there's mud in the streets from all the trucks, the buildings are all kind of dirty, it's like an East German town or something. Truthfully, Aberdeen has spent most of its existence on the decline, steadily withering thanks to the slow collapse of its main export, logging, and the introduction of basically every drug Nancy Reagan warned us about. It was there where Kurt Cobain was born on February 20th, 1967, hardly a decade after the town had gotten rid of prostitution for good and completely unaware of his tragic environment. That was thanks in part to his father, Donald, a mechanic, and especially his mother, Wendy, a homemaker. My mom was always physically affectionate with me. We always kissed goodbye and hugged. It was really cool. I'm surprised to find out that so many families aren't that way. Those were pretty blissful times. Blissful was the perfect word to describe Kurt's early childhood. He was almost comically happy considering who he grew up to be, even getting bullied by the surly kids of Aberdeen for getting too excited about things. This excitement manifested itself in many forms, but none more so than music. He was fascinated by the subject from the age of 2, according to his mom, later being gifted Beatles and Monkees records along with a bass drum from his aunt that only deepened his passion. Kurt would scream and sing and bang his drum all across the streets of Aberdeen without a care in the world. His aunt also tried to teach him how to play guitar, but he wasn't about all that. Truthfully, he couldn't sit still long enough to learn anything. Like many kids of his generation, Kurt was diagnosed with ADHD and had to take Ritalin. Ironically, it only made him stay up at night and fall asleep at school. Still, things stayed pleasant for most of Cobain's childhood. He pursued drumming further, getting a drum set and lessons in the 3rd grade, which I'm sure didn't last long. I wanted to be Ringo Starr, Kurt admitted, just like us all. He didn't even really experience the now obvious poverty he was born into. His mother always took pride in shielding her children from the harsh realities of the world, so much so that Kurt would sometimes bully kids just as poor as him because he thought they were beneath him. It's a weird thing to say about a little kid, but Kurt had a crazy high self-esteem. That is, until 1975, when he was 8 years old and his parents divorced. Kurt's personality shifted basically overnight. Not only did the divorce shatter Kurt's perception of his family's perfection, it also put him at the forefront of a grisly battle. Both his parents would later admit that he and his sister were used as pawns in their court proceedings. His mother would later elaborate. He changed completely. He became real sullen, kind of mad, and always frowning and ridiculing. She recalls when Kurt took a marker to his bedroom wall, writing, "I hate mom, I hate dad, dad hates mom, mom hates dad. It simply makes you want to be sad." Kurt wasn't alone in these feelings. Divorce rates doubled in the 70s with the introduction of no-fault divorce. An entire generation of children were going through exactly what Kurt was going through. Yet, he felt more alone now than ever. I just remember all of a sudden not being the same person, feeling like I wasn't worthy anymore. I didn't feel like I deserved to be hanging out with other kids, because they had parents and I didn't anymore, I guess. I was just pissed off at my parents for not being able to deal with their problems. Throughout most of my childhood after the divorce, I was kind of ashamed of my parents. As awful as the divorce was for Kurt, it was really just the beginning of hard times. Soon his mom got into an abusive relationship, causing Kurt to lash out further, so he was sent to live with his father in the even smaller town of Montesano. There, Don promised never to remarry, only to promptly remarry. Kurt did not appreciate this. With the wedding came a stepmother who Kurt hated well into adulthood, and younger step-siblings whom he wanted nothing to do with. All of a sudden, there was an all-new Cobain family that Kurt could not feel less attached to. Don argues that he tried to do everything to make him feel wanted, while Wendy says he'd just get irritated really quickly and whack over the head. Quotes go back and forth, so much so that even Kurt himself doesn't even have a clear picture of what was going on back then. When asked what his beef was with his father, he answered, "I don't even know. I wish I could remember more. I never felt like I really had a father." The water is muddy over many periods of Cobain's life, but perhaps nowhere more than his middle childhood. Mike Azerrad, a music journalist who tried to document Kurt's life, even went as far as to describe Don's recollection of the era as genuine amnesia. But details aside, we can't refute how Kurt felt during all this. Already isolated by shame, he felt rejected by his own family, all the while still developing interests in art and music that most people couldn't appreciate, especially his father, whose love of sports was so powerful that it was one of the reasons Wendy left him. Still, Don had a shockingly good music collection, after he was somehow convinced to join the Columbia Record Club, a service that encouraged people to buy records and tapes for a penny each. Every month, new music by Led Zeppelin, Aerosmith, Black Sabbath, Queen, and many more would be delivered to the Cobain household. Eventually, Kurt got into the stash and fell in love. After years of bitterness, he finally found joy at his dad's house. Then his dad kicked him out. Like his ex-wife before him, Don just couldn't handle his increasingly rebellious son. Kurt was skipping school, refusing to do chores, picking on his younger stepbrother, and depending on where this fell in the timeline, even getting drunk and doing graffiti. Apparently, rejection from both parents didn't help matters, as he was shuffled from aunt to grandparent back and forth between Montesano and Aberdeen for years, until finally, he was sent to live with his uncle Chuck, a musician, just before his 14th birthday. On the day of, Chuck gave Kurt the choice between two presents, a bike or a guitar. Kurt chose the guitar. The teenage Cobain already struggled to fit in Montesano, but now back in the high-stress environment of Aberdeen after lots of movement between schools, he had plenty of reasons not to make friends that year. Instead, he played guitar. Every day, after school and before bed, he did nothing but practice. He didn't discriminate by genre either. Queen, The Cars, Black Sabbath, AC/DC, basically anything that sounded cool. All by ear, of course. Kurt never learned sheet music. This love for music, without much care for the finer details, stretched its way into Kurt's next fixation: punk rock. This borderline stereotypically disaffected youth was fascinated by the exploits of the Sex Pistols and Cream magazine. The fashion, the lifestyle, the chaos, he wanted to punk. The only issue was, Aberdeen didn't sell any punk records, and you sure as shit weren't gonna hear anything but country music or top 50 on the radio. So, Kurt wrote his own punk rock. 3 chords and a lot of screaming is how he put it. It was like Led Zeppelin, but it was raunchy, and I was trying to make it as aggressive and mean as I could. Turn my little 10-watt amplifier as loud as it could go. I just didn't have any idea what I was doing. Still, this approximation of punk rock lit a fire beneath young Kurt. I just became so obsessed with it. I knew I had something to offer, and I knew eventually I would have the opportunity to show people that I could write good songs, that I could contribute something musically to rock and roll. He wanted to pursue this further. He wanted to form a band and hit the ground running, but Aberdeen wasn't a particularly musical town, and Kurt wasn't a particularly confident person. Every attempt he made at forming a band that year fell apart. In 10th grade, Kurt ended up back at his dad's in Montesano, who forced him to join the local baseball team. There, he warmed the bench alongside an older boy, Matt Lucan, who shockingly shared his interest in rock music, so much so that he played bass in a real-life actual rock band, the Melvins. If Kurt's life wasn't already entirely centered around rock music, the Melvins definitely got him there. Something about being able to witness an actual rock band perform right in front of him was just overwhelming, especially one that had performed in Olympia and Seattle. They were living his dream. Sadly, whether due to nerves or just because, Kurt got incredibly, unbelievably drunk the first time he saw them practice. He complimented them repeatedly and incoherently for hours until finally they kicked him out. But he came right back the next day. Many of you watching already know that the Melvins would go on to be pioneers of grunge, but at this point they weren't much more than a Who or Hendrix cover band. That transition would take years, and Kurt wouldn't be around to see most of it, as after months of begging, his mom finally let him live with her again. There, Kurt continued to practice as discreetly as possible when his mom and stepdad were home. He was singing real low. He did not want us to hear it. But we put our ears to the door, and we both looked at each other, wrinkled up our noses, and said, better stick to the guitar. Cobain would spend the rest of his adolescence in Aberdeen, yet finding a permanent home didn't help his social life much. He was too stoned for the geeks and too geeky for the stoners. There was this one tall weirdo at Aberdeen High that Kurt got good vibes from, but they didn't have any classes together, and Cobain wasn't about to just go up and talk to someone. Thankfully, and coincidentally, the Melvins were in need of a drummer, and they found one in Aberdeen. His name was Dale Crover. Good guy, good drummer, important for later. With the Melvins finally finally back within walking distance, Kurt essentially became the president of their fan club. He even auditioned to play guitar for the band, but he got so nervous in front of them that he literally couldn't play a note. Nevertheless, their influence on him couldn't be overstated. The Melvins had since started that transition I mentioned earlier, and they were making full-on punk rock. The frontman, Buzz Osborne, even gave Kurt some mixtapes that promptly changed his life. Flipper, MDC, and most importantly, Black Flag. It was like listening to something from another planet. It took me a few days to accept it. Punk sounded differently in Kurt's head than in reality, but he fell in love either way. His transition into a real punk rocker came almost literally. To afford a ticket to a Black Flag show in Seattle, Kurt sold his entire record collection for $12. Everything that once defined his love for music was gone. He was a punk. Becoming a punk rocker fed into my low self-esteem because it helped me realize that I don't need to become a rock star. I don't want to become a rock star. So I was fighting this thin line. I was always on the left or right side of not caring or not wanting to and not being able to, yet kind of wanting to at the same time, still wanting to prove myself to people. It's kind of confusing. I'm just really glad I was able to find punk rock. It was really a godsend. It probably also helped that he had been living the punk lifestyle for a while now. At this point, Kurt was reaching the end of his high school career, and it was defined by anything but school. He was getting high every day, drunk whenever possible, and hardly went to class unless he liked the teacher, which he rarely did. Unsurprisingly, his mom kicked him out again, and his dad made one last-ditch effort to clean up his act. To save you some time, Kurt was gone within the week, and he hardly spoke to his dad ever again. With 6 months left of his senior year and 2 years of credits needing making up, he put his foot down and took initiative, doing absolutely nothing for months and dropping out in May of 1985. To put it mildly, his mother was furious, telling him bluntly, "If this doesn't get better, if you don't get a job, you're going to be out. You're going to come home one day and you're going to find your stuff in a box." Cobain took this threat about as seriously as you'd expect, but sure enough, he came home one day to find his stuff in a box. He scrounged together some cash and Don's child support money and put down a deposit on one of many shacks he'd live in the following years. Ultimately, in yet another case of situational irony, Kurt was forced to return to the very school he dropped out of to work as a janitor, scraping gum off the very desks he used to place them. Thankfully, things weren't all bad. He still had the Melvins practice space and his little makeshift fan club, populated by burnouts from across the area just like him. One of which was a rather tall fellow who had previously caught his eye back at Aberdeen High. Krist Novoselic was his name, and young Kurt had just hit the jackpot. Basically, they were soulmates. Not in that way, but in that way. They had pretty much everything in common, from music to alcohol consumption to generally feeling misplaced. Krist was born to Croatian immigrants in Southern California in May of 1965, giving him a great environment to grow up in, which quickly grew too expensive for his family. So when Krist was 14, the Novoselics moved up north to Aberdeen, where they could afford a much nicer house for much less money. It was a great deal for his parents, but for a young Krist who'd only ever known studying California, it was quite the downgrade. Not only climate-wise, but just the environment as a whole. I was perplexed by the weird, twisted social scene they had in Aberdeen. It just seemed like people were a lot more uptight and judgmental. Depression came soon after. His parents, ill-equipped to handle such matters, sent Krist to Croatia for a year and crossed their fingers. Sadly, it didn't do much except introduce him to punk rock, but unlike Kurt, Krist was able to brute force past it, basically becoming Aberdeen's resident party animal. Over time, Novoselic grew more interested in punk rock, which got him close to the Melvins, which got him close to Kurt. Cobain similarly made quite a few friends through the Melvins, and the timing couldn't be better. His roommate had joined the Navy, and after months of charming the landlady into ignoring the late rent, he inevitably got kicked out. His lifestyle and sense for decor didn't help matters, I'm sure. This is the era where the myth of Kurt sleeping under bridges came in, which fans have since come to understand as an exaggeration. He basically just couch surfed around friends' houses, and vans, and front porches. Really, he didn't spend much time on an actual couch. Regardless, he was very proud of this lifestyle. It made him feel free. Yet, Kurt's newfound freedom came with as many drawbacks as it did benefits, the worst of which being drug use. Or the use of many new drugs, at least, with a heavy emphasis on opiates. He explained, "It relieved some of the animosity that I had toward people. I needed to do that because I was tired of hating people so much and being so judgmental of everyone. It just allowed me to have a few days of peace of mind." With Kurt's pursuit of opiates and the ever-rising peak of a new high, his final frontier was obvious: heroin. It was the drug of rock gods like Keith Richards and Iggy Pop, and Aberdeen was such a small town that Kurt thought he could try it once and not get addicted since the supply was so limited. This decision would have no ramifications. Anyways, it wouldn't be long until the punk rock lifestyle finally evolved into making actual punk rock. Or, Kurt's version of punk. That's right, he finally got to form a band. Titled Fecal Matter, it featured Kurt on guitar and vocals, Dale Crover on bass, and some guy on drums. In the beginning of a long and storied tradition, the drummer was just a friend of a friend of a friend who inevitably didn't meet Kurt's standards and got axed. That didn't stop the remaining two members from recording a demo tape, however, and honestly, it didn't sound half bad. Fecal Matter didn't last long, but it had many elements that we'd see in Nirvana, with the demo being held in high regard by some Nirvana fans. At the very least, it impressed someone important. In the months/years, depending on who you ask, since the two met, Kurt had continuously tried to get Krist Novoselic in a band with him, sliding him the demo tape whenever he could and even lending Chris his amp just to sweeten the deal. None of it worked, and Chris couldn't be less interested. Until one day, Kurt picked up the phone and heard, "I finally listened to that tape you made. It's pretty good. We should start a band." It's around here when the timeline starts to wobble a bit, in case that months/years thing from earlier wasn't bad enough. What we do know is that Kurt and Chris started practicing together in the middle months of 1986. It might be March, it might be September, it might be Schmebuary, I don't know. The first drummer they worked with was Bob Mcfadden, who Chris only remembers as some jock guy. In a 1989 interview, Kurt and Chris decided that Bob didn't even count as an official drummer for the band, but later in that same interview they said Nirvana was formed at Olympia, so clearly they were being a little obtuse. The then unnamed band practiced in the empty apartment above Chris's mother's hair salon for a while, but it wasn't long before Bob was out. I was only there for a few weeks, and that's why you won't see me in a lot of the publications, because I was only involved pre-Nirvana, in the really early stuff. Pre-Nirvana's next drummer would be Aaron Burckhard, and this one actually got to play live. The unnamed band practiced like crazy and performed in Tacoma and Olympia. It was a good year for the boys, but another headache timeline-wise. To save you the effort of a long explanation, a lot of sources say Aaron joined in winter of 1987, but he probably joined in winter of 1986 since he played live with the band in April of 1987. Burckhard is considered by most to be Nirvana's first drummer for that reason, but he was by no means a good fit. That's because Aaron Burckhard was a self-proclaimed metalhead who didn't care much for the punk shit or Cobain's rigorous practicing, which distracted him from his job at Burger King. So in the fall of 1987, when Kurt moved in with his girlfriend in Olympia and Chris with his girlfriend in Tacoma, they just sort of lost touch with Aaron. In his place was Dale Crover, who joined in winter of 1987. If you'll remember, Dale was the Melvins drummer that made them move to Aberdeen and the bassist for Fecal Matter. The man is a hell of a musician, but slippery as an eel due to his ongoing commitment to the Melvins. So as soon as the band got their hands on him, they got to work recording a demo. Kurt found the cheapest studio in Seattle, Reciprocal Recording, and scheduled 6 hours on January 23, 1988. Thanks to the band catching themselves a respected drummer, they even got Jack Endino, a local legend, to help out as engineer and unofficial producer. All in all, they recorded and mixed 10 songs in 6 hours, with Kurt doing all his vocals in one take, and the whole thing only costing the band $152.44. Following the completion of the demo, there was good news and bad news. Bad news, the eel had finally slipped from their hands and Dale Crover was gone. Good news, Jack Endino was very impressed. So impressed, he made himself a copy and gave it to his old pal Jonathan Poneman. He becomes important later. Poneman also loved it and showed it to anybody who was anybody in the Seattle rock scene, shouting, "If anyone wants to get rich, this band is looking for a drummer." However, the band's next drummer wouldn't come from Seattle at all. Nope, Dale Crover recommended Dave Foster as his replacement, an Aberdeen native, and Dave is a great example of why Nirvana had so many drummers. Nobody understood them. Bob Mcfadden was a jock, Aaron Burckhard was a metalhead, Dave Foster had a mustache. It just wasn't gonna work. In all seriousness, the mustache was a factor. It was emblematic of Foster's otherness. He'd just never seen anything like us before. We were just total counterculture people. Chris and Kurt argued that he seemed to be uncomfortable around them, while Dave later rebutted, "I think they were the ones who were uncomfortable." Who felt what aside, Foster also happened to have a crazy anger problem. He'd get in fights and beat the hell out of people, Chris commented. The pot finally boiled over one night when Dave found out that his girlfriend had been cheating on him. Without knowing who the guy was, he tracked him down and beat him up. Unfortunately, that guy was the mayor's son from a nearby town. Foster ended up getting 2 weeks in jail plus a revoked license. He didn't receive a call from the band, but he was out. Aaron Burckhard was back in, but that wouldn't last either. Shortly after his reunion with the band, Aaron borrowed Kurt's car and got pulled over. Sadly, Burckhard was drunk, and the cop was named Springsteen. "Hey Bruce, what's up, Bruce?" Aaron gave the cop a bad time, and according to Krist, even called him a word that I won't repeat. Burckhard was arrested, Kurt's car got impounded, and the idiot was out of the band for good. At this point, Kurt and Krist were sick of big burly men with something to prove, so they found the opposite, Chad Channing. He's an elf. He should be in the Keebler factory. He's also one of the nicest people I've ever met. Aww. That was the most important thing to them. No more slurs or bar fights, just a good guy. As a drummer, I think the average Nirvana fan can tell you Chad was no John Bonham. Regardless, he played his first show with the band in May of 1988, only 4 months since the demo was recorded, to tell you how quickly they were burning through drummers, and he was good enough. Speaking of good enough, May of 1988 was also only a few months after Nirvana had chosen the name Nirvana. Before then, they just played under the first name that came to mind each night, starting with Skid Row, which Kurt chose at the last minute before their second show. Then came Ted Fred, Pencap Chew, Throat Oyster, Windowpane, and Bliss, which is a name that Chad first heard. But none were really built to last. Much in the same vein as the artist's music, Kurt didn't want something that sounded like everyone else. I wanted a name that was kind of beautiful, or nice, or pretty, instead of a mean, raunchy punk rock name like the Angry Samoans. I wanted to have something different. Kurt settled on Nirvana, based on the Hindu and Buddhist concept of oblivion to care, pain, or external reality. Seattle was catching wind of the band, Chad was on drums, and Nirvana was officially Nirvana. All the dominoes were lining up for a very interesting chapter of the band's career. But this video is already too long, so we'll save that for another day. If you liked the video, like the video. If you liked me, subscribe. I make more videos, so you should watch those videos. Thank you. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Mike Azerrad and his book, Come As You Are. It was the biggest, most important source for this video, and I couldn't have made it without that research that they did. 25 hours of interviews. It's very good. Go listen to it. I'm running out of time. Goodbye.